Others were torn away in the most shocking of fashions. One tale, whispered with horror in Rome, tells of a noblewoman named Livia or Stilla. On the day of her wedding, not to Caligula, but to another man, the emperor appeared uninvited. Struck by her beauty, he ordered her seized from her husband and declared her his bride. The humiliation was absolute. A marriage sanctified one moment was desecrated the next, all because the emperor desired it. Days later, when the novelty had faded, he abandoned her as casually as he had taken her. Another victim was Lalia Paulina, famed for her wealth and elegance. Caligula, deciding that her beauty must serve him, forced her into marriage. Yet as swiftly as he possessed her, he cast her aside, forbidding her ever again to touch another man. Her life became a gilded prison, her honor a casualty of his whims. But the cruelest fate fell upon Milone Caesonia, a woman who was neither young nor celebrated for beauty, yet who bore Caligula's only child. He paraded her before the people in scant attire, boasting of her debauchery, reveling in the scandal it provoked. To him, even his wife was not a partner, but a stage prop, a vessel through which he could display Rome's submission to his will. Through these marriages, Caligula reduced sacred vows to mockery. Each union was not an act of love, but of domination, a reminder that in Rome under his rule, nothing, neither husband, wife, nor family bond, was beyond his grasp. For the senators who watched their daughters and wives become pawns in this grotesque theater, the message was unmistakable. Caligula could violate not only their laws and their dignity, but their very households. The empire was not ruled by custom or tradition. It was ruled by his appetite. And in this, perhaps, lay the deepest cruelty of all, not in the public executions, not in the arena spectacles, but in the private destruction of the most intimate bonds of Roman life. To Caligula, love was weakness. Loyalty was illusion. Marriage was merely another stage upon which to perform his power. Part 13. The Divine Child. In the final years of Caligula's reign, the boundaries between emperor, man, and God dissolved into something feverish, something blasphemous. If Rome had once worshipped its emperors in death, Caligula demanded worship in life. And at the center of this divine theater stood his daughter, Julia Drusilla, the child he proclaimed not merely as heir, but as goddess incarnate. Drusilla's name was already sacred to Caligula. His beloved sister, Julia Drusilla, had been the only person he ever seemed to love without cruelty. When she died young, he mourned her not as a man mourns a sibling, but as a disciple mourns a deity. He consecrated her as a goddess, declared public festivals in her honor, and wept openly in the Senate. Her death carved a wound in his psyche, and into that wound, obsession took root. So when his daughter was born, he gave her the same name, Julia Drusilla. To Caligula, this was not coincidence but continuity. The divine flame of his sister, he believed, had returned in the body of his child. From her earliest days, the infant was paraded not as a mere child of the imperial household, but as something more. Caligula referred to her as the daughter of gods, the living embodiment of his divinity. Twins were minted bearing her image alongside his own, a blasphemy that unsettled even the most pliant senator. At public games, he would present her to the crowd as if unveiling a holy relic. The people of Rome, who once adored the birth of imperial heirs, now watched in uneasy silence. To them, the baby was not a symbol of continuity or hope, but of Caligula's terrifying delusion that blood alone could carry divinity from one body to the next. And behind this, darker whispers lingered. Some claimed that Caligula's obsession with his child was not only paternal but sacrilegious, echoing the rumors of his incestuous bonds with his sisters. Whether truth or slander, the stories spread like wildfire, deepening the sense that the emperor's household was no longer a family but a twisted parody of Rome's sacred traditions. That for Caligula, it was all part of the same vision, a dynasty not of mortals, but of gods. By enthroning his daughter as divine, he sought to bind the future of Rome to his bloodline in a way no law or Senate decree could undo. But fate had other plans. Julia Drusilla, the divine child, did not live to fulfill her father's delusion. She died in infancy, leaving behind only the echo of her father's madness and the lingering fear that Rome itself had been cursed by the gods he claimed to embody. Part 14. Slaves, confidants, and fear. In an empire where even senators trembled and generals bowed their heads, Caligula's truest companions were not Rome's nobility, but those bound to him by chains, his slaves and personal attendants. Within the marble corridors of the Palatine, power flowed not only through gilded halls, but through whispers carried by those who served his every whim. The emperor understood a cruel paradox. Slaves, though powerless, could be trusted more than nobles. Senators plotted, generals dreamed of legions and crowns, but a slave's life depended entirely on the emperor's favor. They could betray no one without betraying themselves. And so, Caligula confided in them, shared his laughter, his paranoia, even his darkest schemes. Some of these slaves rose to extraordinary influence. Chamberlains who once fetched wine or carried messages now whispered in the emperor's ear during council. A word of flattery could win them gold, land, or authority beyond their station. A careless glance could condemn them to death. They lived as both favored pets and trembling captives, reflections of Rome itself under Caligula. Yet the emperor's reliance on slaves was not born of affection. It was born of fear. He trusted no one fully, not his generals, not his senators, not even his wives or family. Every face was a mass hiding dagger. By elevating slaves above the nobility, he struck at Rome's very hierarchy, showing its elite that they were worth less than the men who polished his sandals. Confidants of low birth carried secrets that emperors once shared only with consuls or tribunes. They delivered accusations, forged letters, and spread rumors that fed Caligula's paranoia. The line between servant and spy blurred until no one in the palace could be certain who truly stood beside the emperor or who might be listening in the shadows. Fear became the currency of survival. Senators flattered him by day, then paid bribes to slaves by night, desperate to learn what mood the emperor woke in, what whim might decide their fate. In this way, even the mighty became supplicants before those they once despised. But Caligula himself was not immune to the poison he brewed. Surrounded by flatterers, informers, and slaves who thrived on his instability, he drifted deeper into suspicion. Each whisper confirmed his darkest fears. Each rumor fed his belief that treason was everywhere. And in this suffocating atmosphere, the emperor's madness did not simply grow, it was cultivated, pruned, and sharpened by those who survived best in fear. The palace, once the beating heart of the empire, became a labyrinth of shadows where trust was impossible, loyalty was bought and sold, and the emperor himself was prisoner to the paranoia he had unleashed. Part 15. The Guard becomes witness. The Praetorian Guard was Rome's sword and shield, the emperor's protectors, sworn to defend his life with their own. But under Caligula, the men of the Guard became more than soldiers. They became witnesses, unwilling spectators to the unraveling of an empire. From the moment he rose to power, Caligula understood the Guard's importance. He showered them with gifts, doubled their pay, and addressed them as comrades. Their loyalty secured his throne when the Senate hesitated. For a time, the Praetorians cheered him as a savior, but loyalty cannot survive in a court of madness. Day after day, the Guard stood watch as Caligula humiliated senators, desecrated traditions, and indulged in spectacles of cruelty. They were ordered to drag nobles into the arena, to enforce seizures of wealth, to stand silently while families begged for mercy. Their spears became instruments not of protection, but of tyranny. The men who once swore to defend Rome's order now found themselves enforcing its destruction. And all the while, they saw the emperor not as the god he claimed to be, but as a man laughing, trembling, raging, often drunk, sometimes deranged. The intimacy of their position stripped away illusion. They guarded his chambers at night, listening to his muttered dreams, his sudden bursts of laughter or fury. They escorted him through crowds, feeling the shift in public mood, adoration turning to silence, silence to dread. They saw the nobles flinch at his presence, the people avert their eyes, the senators forced to cheer with hollow voices. And slowly, the Guard began to grasp a truth that Rome dared not speak aloud. The emperor was vulnerable. His body was flesh, not divine. His life hung not on the favor of Jupiter, but on the blades of the very men who stood beside him. History would later say that Caligula's cruelty sowed his own destruction. But in reality, it was his intimacy with the Praetorian Guard, his daily reliance on them, that sealed his fate. For no mask of divinity could hide madness from those who lived in its shadow. They were not simply soldiers. They were the closest audience to his reign. And in the end, the Praetorian Guard would not only bear witness to his rule, they would bring it to an end. Part 16. Palaces of Terror. Rome's palaces had once been symbols of majesty. Marble halls where Augustus plotted empire, where Tiberius secured the throne, where senators and generals debated the fate of nations. But under Caligula, these sanctuaries of power became labyrinths of dread, palaces of terror. Within the towering walls of the Palatine, fear was the air men breathed. Senators summoned to dine with the emperor walked in trembling silence, unsure whether they would leave in triumph or chains. The banquets glittered with gold and silver, yet beneath the laughter hung the constant threat of death. A toast could turn into a sentence. A joke could become treason. The emperor delighted in keeping his court suspended between hope and terror. One day he would drape nobles in robes of honor, praising their loyalty before all. The next, he would order their estates seized, their families humiliated, their names struck from the rolls of Rome. None could predict his mood. None could feel safe. The very walls seemed to conspire with him. Secret chambers and narrow corridors allow slaves and informers to slip silently through the palace, carrying whispers of private conversations straight to the emperor's ear. A careless word spoken in confidence could be repeated by morning, twisted into accusation by noon, punished by night. Even Caligula's entertainments fed the terror. He would summon guests into torchlit halls, where actors staged grotesque plays of betrayal and death, the themes drawn from Rome's own bloody history. The audience, forced to applaud, could not help but see themselves reflected in the fates of the doom. For the common people, the palaces loomed like storm clouds over the city, distant yet suffocating. Tales of what happened inside trickled into the streets. Senators forced to crawl on their knees, noblewomen paraded in chains, executions carried out in the private gardens where fountains once sang. Truth blurred with rumor, but the effect was the same. The palace was no longer the beating heart of Rome, but its haunted soul. In those closest to Caligula lived as captives of fear. His wives, his sisters, his confidants all knew that a smile today could not shield them from the executioner tomorrow. In the palaces of terror, intimacy was not a blessing but a curse, and through it all, Caligula thrived. To him, fear was proof of his divinity. Every trembling senator, every groveling general, every whisper silenced in the shadows testified that he was not merely emperor, but God. Yet within these same palaces, beneath gilded ceilings and painted gods, the seeds of his destruction took root. For when terror becomes unbearable, it ceases to inspire obedience. It inspires knives. Part 17. Religion reforged in lust. Rome had always walked a delicate line between politics and the divine. Emperors were men, yet in death, they might be raised to the status of gods. Temples bore their names. Statues stood beside Jupiter and Mars. Worship was power, but it was framed in solemnity, tradition, and restraint. Caligula shattered that balance. He did not wait for death to claim divinity, he demanded it in life. He styled himself as Neos Helios, the new sun. Temples once devoted to Jupiter were rededicated to him. Priests who had long guarded Rome's most sacred rites now sacrificed not to the gods of Olympus, but to Caligula himself. He placed his own statue in the Temple of Jerusalem, a desecration so shocking it nearly ignited revolt. But it was not enough to be worshipped as a god. Caligula sought to merge divinity with desire, to fuse religion with lust. In his vision, the act of worship was not solemn sacrifice, it was submission to his body, his pleasure. He paraded himself dressed as Apollo, as Mercury, even as Venus, flaunting both masculine and feminine garb, mocking the boundaries of tradition. In lavish ceremonies, he demanded women of noble blood serve as his priestesses, not to honor the gods, but to serve his passions under the guise of sacred ritual. For Caligula, the temple was not a house of the divine, but a theater where sex, humiliation, and power played their roles. Whispers claimed that he transformed entire sanctuaries into brothels, where matrons and maidens of Rome, seized from their families, were forced to act as sacred prostitutes in service to the living god. Coins and offerings once destined for Jupiter's altar were redirected into Caligula's coffers, feeing both his treasury and his excess. The most shocking of all was his treatment of his sisters. To the Roman mind, the family was sacred, the hearth, untouchable. Caligula defiled it, declaring that his incestuous unions were not crimes but holy rites. Just as the gods mingled freely among themselves, he proclaimed, so too could he. By violating the sanctity of his own bloodline, he presented himself as not merely above law, but above nature itself. Religion, once the backbone of Roman identity, became a mask for degradation. Worshippers no longer raised prayers to the heavens, they bowed their heads to a tyrant whose lust was endless. But this perversion of faith came at a cost. To the people, to the priests, even to hardened senators, the line between piety and blasphemy was not so easily erased. Each act of desecration deepened the sense that Rome was not merely ruled by a madman, but cursed by the very gods he mocked. Caligula believed he had reforged religion into a tool of his own desire. In truth, he had forged something else entirely, the justification for his enemies to act. For when an emperor turns the gods into his accomplices, even the most fearful begin to whisper, perhaps the gods themselves demand his blood. Part 18. The fall of the divine madman. For nearly 4 years, Caligula had ruled Rome with terror, lust, and spectacle. He had paraded himself as a god, humiliated the Senate, desecrated the temples, and turned the empire into his personal stage. But beneath the marble and gold, beneath the cries of the arena and the groveling of senators, something darker stirred, a will to end him. The people had grown silent. Where once they had cheered his arrival, now they averted their eyes. The Senate seethed in humiliation, bound by fear but stripped of dignity. Even the Praetorian Guard, the men who stood closest to him, who saw the madness in his eyes, had begun to whisper. The plot was not born of one man, but of many. Senators, nobles, officers of the guard, each had suffered his insults, each had seen families ruined, fortunes seized, dignity destroyed. The tipping point came when Caligula, in his frenzy of divinity, threatened to move the empire's capital from Rome to Alexandria, where he believed the people would worship him as pharaoh. To the Senate and guard elect, this was treason, not just against them, but against Rome itself. Among the conspirators was Cassius Caria, a Praetorian tribune whom Caligula had mocked relentlessly, ridiculing his voice, questioning his masculinity. For Caria, the assassination was not only duty, it was vengeance. On the 24th of January, 41 C, the trap was set. The emperor left the theater at the Palatine, striding through the covered passageways with his usual entourage. The Praetorians flanked him, their faces blank, their hands steady on their swords. Caligula, oblivious, was already planning his next spectacle. Then, in a narrow corridor, the blades flashed. Caria struck first, his dagger plunging deep into the emperor's neck. Caligula staggered, shrieking not as a god but as a man. Others joined in swords hacking, stabbing, tearing into the flesh of the man who had once claimed immortality. His cries echoed against marble walls, drowned out by the fury of his own guard. When at last he fell, bleeding into the dust of the palace, the divine madman lay revealed for what he truly was, mortal, fragile, broken. His body was hacked beyond recognition, left as carrion for those who had feared him. But Rome's fury did not stop with him. His wife, Caesonia, was cut down. His infant daughter, the divine child, was dashed against a wall, erasing the bloodline he had sought to enthrone as gods. The dynasty of Caligula ended not in ceremony, but in slaughter. The Senate, trembling but emboldened, moved swiftly to restore control. The guards, uncertain of the future, scrambled to choose a new master. Within the empire that Caligula had twisted into his nightmare began reshaping itself, as if eager to erase his memory. Yet his shadow lingered. Rome had seen emperors before, and it would see emperors after, but none would leave such a stain of terror, blasphemy, and humiliation. To the people, Caligula was not just a tyrant. He was a warning that when one man places himself above gods and laws elect, the empire itself trembles on the edge of ruin. And so ended the reign of Gaius Caligula, Rome's divine madman, struck down not by foreign foes or rival kings, but by the very men sworn to protect him.